Who funds the reparations? Who funds the reparations? Who's going to pay? Is it going to be another tax, a 0.2% tax on top to pay for the reparations? Or we are going to be very creative, and we're talking about some of these things with Jackson to say, it could be built in the foreign policy conversations and the domestic policy conversations. Foreign policy could be in the sense that, not to hit on the British, but the British had a hand in some of these things. They might say they don't. But one of the things that they could do is to support the building of museums, which is more developmental, which is more symbolic in nature, tying in with the communal reparations. So the question about who funds and who pays for that, I think is an issue. We also felt that there has to be some careful reflections around sequencing, because everything is important. If you ask someone who is aggrieved, everything is important to them. But you can also join mechanisms. The formal mechanisms, of which the NPRC is one, then the informal mechanisms, which include the religious and the traditional, because there are others who believe in that, to create complementarity. But there's need for the formal mechanisms to recognize that the informal, which are the religious and the traditional, have been doing this before the formal came in, right? So that's an important, I think it will take humility for that point to be acknowledged. Looking at the current context, we felt that it was going to be impossible or difficult to talk about issues such as prosecutions. They might happen, but they might be selective, depending on, I'm not going to use the word that I wanted to use, but they'll be difficult to carry out. And holding accountable some perpetrators might be difficult. One might have to wait until the perpetrator is no longer in a position of authority or of influence to be willing to come forward, because there are power dynamics and power relations. So there's also need to have what we are calling the perpetrator's versions of the truth. I think we might not like it, we might be very uncomfortable with it, but they also have got something to say, right? And that something has to be curated, gathered, and kept somewhere, or made public if it's supposed to be made public. What policies or measures can be put in place to deal with the challenges of the formal, informal, or the combination of both? Because some might say the criminal will supersede the informal. So a police officer might supersede a traditional leader, or might supersede a discussion that a faith or a religious leader is having with two different parties. Right. So how do we deal with those complexities? There is the issue of amnesties. There were amnesties that were in the past. And should we be exploring granting of amnesties on condition of telling the truth, or saying there's no blanket amnesty whatsoever? You might not necessarily have committed a grave offense, but you might have given an unlawful order, which resulted in a grave offense being committed, and it's regrettable. So how do you deal with those dynamics? The ninth point: is there appetite at the present moment to make transitional justice a government-wide approach than just limiting it to the work of the NPRC? Our argument is that the NPRC is just but one mechanism of dealing with transitional justice. It's not the beginning and the end. It's not the soul. It doesn't have monopoly on dealing with transitional justice. But the question that we posed is there appetite at the present moment to have a government-wide approach to dealing with the past, or it's going to be placed squarely on the hands of the NPRC. Anything else outside that is not going to be entertained. The 10th point. I'm almost done because I can see everyone is looking at me seriously. Is there need for a peace and reconciliation policy together with the transitional justice policy? Or we just deal with the transitional justice policy? So you will recall, well, at least I read, I'm about to disclose my age by saying this. At least I read that at independence there was a statement that was made by the then Prime Minister, which actually was then interpreted to mean a reconciliation policy. Right? If you read the books, they say we had a reconciliation policy because we said we forgive and we forget. Anki Dori, all is done. Right? That became the policy. But fast forward, we then see things unfolding. Right? So we probably lied to ourselves that we'd reconciled with our past. So the question that we had is, beyond the transitional justice, is there need for something along those lines? The 11th point that I think we need to bring to your attention is that some people become ready to speak after 10 years when the NPRC is gone. That's when they'll be ready. And it's okay. It's very much okay that they'll be ready after 10 years. But the question is, would there be space for them to speak at that juncture if you're confining this formal mechanism to 10 years? As we know, grieving and dealing with these issues is a process. So you cannot specify and box it. You can, for purposes of measurement of impact monitoring and evaluation, those who deal with log frames and all that. But you can't put healing into a log frame. It will not work. As we used to say, it can't. So what then becomes the levels of disclosure? Because the levels of disclosure and willingness to participate in any transitional justice process is likely to be influenced by the level of success of the NPRC going forward. So I think people are watching what the NPRC is doing or not doing, and that for them will be a litmus test of whether they are really going to engage with any state or non-state processes. So the confidence and trust deficit, kicks in. The last point, the very almost last point. How do we allow other forms of transitional justice beyond state-led processes? Civil society, church, etc. The state does not need to have monopoly on implementation, or it never has had, because there's a multi-stakeholder approach. Does starting a policy conversation with the government open up other issues or cause stagnation of the work of the NPRC? Or we see it as complementing transitional justice mechanisms? Lastly, we have spoken about religious and African traditional mechanisms, which have been used before and partly now ignored or politicized. But there's a fundamental point that we tend to miss, that these mechanisms, our pastors, our traditional leaders, have also been affected by this conflict. And we are dealing with an equally wounded leadership in those spaces. Because they've bore the brunt of the violence. People who were being victimized were running to the church, were running to the community leaders. But we think that these traditional mechanisms and leaders and religious leaders are strong enough that they will continue to carry the weight. So there's need also to look at that. Those were just the critical reflections and the hard choices that we think have to be made. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Jackson and Otto for drafting these critical reflections. Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of the program, finally, for some of you. I think just in reflecting on today's session, or the second session from policy to practice, indeed we've managed to move in the right direction, and it's been incredibly inspiring also to see that we've actually managed to draft some key specific recommendations, which hopefully also will feed into the birth of the draft TJ policy framework for Zimbabwe as one of the objectives of this TJ symposium. So I'd just like to close the session by saying thank you to all my wonderful panelists and to the audience, and for being patient and powering through. It's been a very long day, and I hear tomorrow is even going to be longer. So please ensure that you get proper rest and food, and thank you very much for applause. Thank you. Zikamai will just give us the few announcements to guide us for tomorrow's excursion.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, Otto, and Jackson.